This is your breaking news World War III update. So we have some good news and some bad news. The good news is there's a tentative agreement between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin to have a meeting next week in one of the many U.S. Middle Eastern vassal states. Now, this, of course, would put Russia at a distinct security and logistical disadvantage when it comes to ensuring the safety of Vladimir Putin going into the lion's den like this. But this is part of the reason why MBZ was in Moscow, was to assist in facilitating such a meeting. Now, the question is this all just a stalling tactic? Is it actually going to happen? What are the deals that are being proposed? Is this just the U.S. engaging in the same perfidious behavior that they have in the past, where they befriend their adversary only to stab them in the back? We're going to talk about all of that today. But know this, in order for Vladimir Putin to feel secure venturing out into the lion's den in such a way, the security planning would have to have been quite extensive over the past weeks and months, and that would entail an alternative universe of back-channel communication that does not mirror the diplomatic facade that we, the public, are currently exposed to. Meaning that this is a plan that is being in the works for some time, which is highly unusual considering the level of nuclear brinkmanship in recent days. Consider that we have went from nuclear submarine deployments to a potential face-to-face meeting with Putin and Trump next week. That is punctuated escalation. Now, I'm going to tell you why I think the Russians have tentatively agreed to this, and even gone so far to say that the U.S. has made an offer that we deem to be acceptable in terms of territorial concessions by either side. I think it's because the Russians see the game that is being played here, and they don't want to appear obstinate in terms of the international community and how this diplomatic facade is playing out. They know that the Americans are setting up a straw man. They know that the whole goal of this is to create such a display that would have Russia being the disagreeable ones, the obstinate ones who refused a face-to-face talks and a proposed deal within the time frame of Trump's ultimatum, and therefore we needed to retaliate and deploy these sanctions. They don't want to be the ones who are perceived as having hindered these potential talks, which is why the Kremlin has now agreed, at least in principle, to partaking in these meetings next week, as insane as that would be and as much of a security liability as it would be for Putin. Now, if Putin's plane gets shot down or if he gets assassinated, the nukes are in the air. There's no question about that. And indeed, we're entering a very dangerous time because there's a lot of hawkish people on both sides who want the war to continue at the same level of intensity as it is right now. So it will be interesting to see whether or not this actually materializes, because right now the price of gold is not reflecting this. Remember, gold is the currency of war, and the price of gold is in fact up today, very likely will close at a record high, which would seem highly unusual on a day when you're talking about prospective Russian sanction relief and even the relinquishing of some of the seized assets that have been held by the West. The price of gold should theoretically be crashing right now, because one of the chief reasons why it shot up in the first place was because the West decided to seize $300 billion in Russian assets and start to spend the returns that were generated on that wealth. So this is why I'm not buying what's happening right now. And it's interesting that we're not seeing the textbook bloviation of Donald Trump on social media about this. Now, he might come out today and unleash a litany of social media posts bragging about the potential talks with Vladimir Putin, but we're not hearing that. And in fact, we've heard nothing but nuclear rhetoric in the past few days, which is highly unusual for a meeting to succeed that sort of brinkmanship. And then you have to ask the question, of course, if the meeting happens, there's going to be some endearing optics which will, appease people and put some people at ease, at least temporarily. But the fallout from a meeting in which nothing is conclusive and there is no agreement could be absolutely devastating, in the same way that Trump and Vladimir Putin have been on the phone on several occasions over the past few months. And here we are talking about nuclear submarines and building nukes every single day of the week. That's something that people need to consider. If 2 phone calls with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin yielded nuclear brinkmanship, what will a failed face-to-face talk yield? Now, we have to be cautiously optimistic because we don't want any more people being hauled off the streets against their will in vans and conscripted and sent to the front lines to die for rich man's wars. We should be happy that there is a potential détente, or at least a kicking of the can down the road temporarily. But I quite frankly am not buying it, and gold isn't buying it. The U.S. deeming the Russians yesterday, the White House put out a statement, an official statement, deeming the Russians an enemy of the United States, and et cetera, et cetera. There's so many data points of escalation, as I talked about yesterday, in and around Belarus that have likely prompted the acceleration of this ceasefire deadline timeline, that none of this really adds up. And you can see the level of consternation in the Kremlin with Putin's body language in accepting this meeting. You could cut the tension with a knife. And so the lack of Trump Truth Social bloviation about this, and the lack of, in the unusual body language of Vladimir Putin, tells me that both sides are agreeing to this meeting. They both understand it's a perfidious, underhanded attempt to try to sabotage the other, but they're both going along with it. And it's interesting because the Kremlin never made any statements yesterday, but suddenly today it's almost as if they clued into what the West was potentially cooking up here, and it was to make the Russians seem like a disagreeable, obstinate pariah who is not negotiating in good faith, and therefore we need to escalate the conflict. That all of this was being cooked up knowing that the Kremlin wouldn't accept it. So now that the Kremlin has accepted, is Washington in fact scratching their head saying, holy shit, they actually agreed to meet? That would be a bit of a wild card. So we got an interesting week ahead, and all of this, of course, is within the deadline. So if you're a Russia hawk, and these are the people who would potentially want to sabotage any sort of peace deal, and of course the potential for a false flag is very high right now from both sides, because there's many people who want to see the war going and who want to continue to use Ukraine as NATO's battering ram. This very well could all just be sabotaged by one of those elements. And it really would look like Putin was kowtowing to Donald Trump, who just made nuclear threats, who imposed this ultimatum, and then all of a sudden the Kremlin is agreeing to meet next week. Now, the Kremlin doesn't really care about a lot of this superficial stuff. They're more than willing to probably take a hit in terms of the public perception of them as weak. They're probably okay with that because, of course, they're playing to win, not to look good. So they might be okay with making that sort of concession, but it still seems, something seems way off with this. Now, the actual agreement to be made is, as far as I know, the details are not entirely clear at this point, but that Russia would make some territorial concessions along the Sumy region axis, and that the Ukrainians would relinquish control of parts of the annexed territories, namely in Kherson and Zaporozhye, where the Russians want to complete that annexation. That itself too seems unusual, and now there are reports coming out that Ukraine is denying all of this, despite the surprisingly dovish tone of Zelensky on all of this, insisting that the war must end. Again, it really starts to look like they're painting this picture of, we want to end the war, but Vladimir Putin didn't, ergo Vladimir Putin bad guy, and gold isn't buying it. That's all there is to it. Even the price of oil should be crashing. Gold should be crashing through the floor at this point, because a lot of this is contingent. It's not only contingent on the seizure of Russian assets. It's obviously contingent on the money printing over the last few years, the depreciation or the devaluing of the US dollar and BRICS and things of that nature. But we should still be seeing a crash in gold and silver. In fact, silver, of course, is for weapons of war. Gold is the currency of war. Neither of those things is happening right now, guys. So I suspect that if these talks are real and it actually happens that Donald Trump meets with Vladimir Putin, the potential fallout from a failed meeting could be absolutely catastrophic. Remember what happened after those two failed phone calls. We were on the brink of nuclear Armageddon in the past week with the deployment of nuclear submarines. So just imagine what could potentially happen if there was a fallout after a face-to-face, which is, of course, the penultimate diplomatic channel of communication that leaders have. And it's not without precedent historically that this whole Trojan horse strategy of bearing gifts to your enemy before you go into war with them has been utilized. In fact, that was what created the complacency that led to Operation Barbarossa in World War II, where the Germans took advantage of agreements and pacts made with the Soviet Union before engaging in the single biggest attack on a country in history, involving millions of soldiers. So the Russians have to be thinking that that's what this is, which is why they're kind of playing along. And then I'll conclude with this. Of course, it is in the interests of both countries to make it appear up until the final moment that everything is fine, so not to panic their population, so they can move their military throughout the many corridors in their countries to the appropriate locations without being hindered by the gridlock of panicked people trying to flee the cities. And this is just a reality that at this stage in the game, both sides would have a vested interest in downplaying the threat. So indeed, if we were in a high state of nuclear tension and approaching a DEFCON 2 situation, then we would likely see both sides saying that everything is good. And neither side will deny the other side, because they both know that they're preparing in secret. Again, I think it's highly unusual that the security detail for such an event would be so sound that it would embolden Putin to venture out from behind the Kremlin to meet face-to-face with Trump. It just seems very unusual that such a thing would happen. But let's just see. It's likely just going to be for the purpose of strategic sequencing. And so if we do see a brief detente or cool down in hostilities in Ukraine, that likely means that another conflagration will flare up elsewhere, because the U.S. is fighting on three fronts, let's not remember. And many countries have vested interests in, like, all the three theaters of war have a vested interest in the other theater opening up. The Russians would benefit if the Taiwan front opened up, because that would take attention away from them. The Iranians benefit from when from the Russia-Ukraine war is flaring up, because that takes attention away from them. There's nothing the Iranians want more than for the war in Ukraine and Iran or Russia to keep going. There's nothing that the Russians want more than the U.S. to focus on Iran, and vice versa. They want to distribute the capability of the U.S., because then that creates more vulnerabilities and potential inroads for progress from their point of view. So that is the most up-to-date information with respect to this. But it's interesting, despite all of this, we're not seeing huge amounts of information that are confirming this or celebrating this. Again, we're not seeing that textbook bloviation on Trump on social media about, how this is the greatest, bestest meeting ever, which, leads me to believe that maybe he just hasn't had his morning coffee yet. I don't know. But there's something off with this. It seems like this would be a cause for huge celebration if this was the case. Or this really is just the beginning of the real Cold War, and whatever remnants of Ukraine remain will be integrated into the EU and into NATO and along the Dnieper River, as many long since suspected. You would have the further militarization and rearmament and, long-range missiles, no intermediate nuclear forces treaties, and we'll just be forever on the brink of nuclear Armageddon with the Russians. But I am very concerned about the next week because this could all just be a front. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I also know that, and I've been saying this since day one, you can go back in my videos, yes, Trump will meet with Vladimir Putin, but he'll meet with him in the same way he met with Kim Jong-un, and absolutely nothing will be resolved. Okay, this could just fester under the surface for a few months, for a few years, if some sort of détente is struck. But ultimately, there has to be a winner in this conflict, and that is yet to be determined. And the material reality of Trump threatening sanctions against countries who persist in buying Russian oil, the major technically advanced oil refinery that went up in smoke today, the Storm Shadow missiles that have been descending across Russian regions and annexed territories over the past 24 hours, that material reality does not reflect a cooling in hostilities. And certainly the nuclear rhetoric that preceded all of this talk of meetings didn't either. So it's a high-stakes game. I get that. And in high-stakes games, you can see extremes. What's that old Stalin quote? You know, there will be years where nothing happens, and then there'll be days where years happen. So that could be what this is. We could have just reached an impasse. But if indeed the timeline has been fast-tracked because the West feels it's at a disadvantage and the Russians are about to make a military breakthrough, a lot of pressure is going to be on Vladimir Putin to continue with that momentum. There are hawks on both sides, which could potentially foment the conditions for a false flag attack in an attempt to derail whatever dovish plans and intentions either side has. That's the information I have for you right now. And I will touch base with you if more information comes out. This is a very fluid situation, and we will attempt to keep you apprised of what's going on and do my best to speculate as accurately as possible what it all means. But that's what I think. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.